Good morning. I'm calling to order the Marin Water Finance and Administration Committee meeting and the Board of Directors for April 28th, 2022. Our first item of business is to call the roll.
Director Bregman.
Here.
Director Russell.
Here.
And Chair Kohler.
I'm here. I now need a motion to adopt the agenda.
Moved.
Second.
Do we have any comment on the agenda, on adoption of the agenda?
There are none.
Okay, then we need a roll call.
Director Bregman.
Aye.
Director Russell.
Aye.
And Chair Kohler.
Aye. Terry, do we have any public comment on items that are not on the agenda?
There are none.
Okay, we're moving right along. That brings us to the minutes of the March 24th meeting. I am looking for a motion.
That was a
Motion to approve the minutes.
Yeah.
Or second, either way. Pick your poison.
Terry, you got that?
Yeah.
I'm going to second it.
Okay.
All right.
Hey, Matthew.
Direct.
Oh, wait. We need to, do we have any public comment on the approval of the minutes?
There are none.
Great, then we need a roll call.
Director Bregman.
Aye.
Director Russell.
Aye.
Director Schmidt.
Monty, you're muted. You are
Director-
still muted.
There we go.
There.
There we go.
We're just looking for your vote on approving the minutes from the last meeting.
Come on out, Docs. Come on. Get out.
Okay, do you want to just come to me and then go back to him?
Yeah. Chair Kohler.
Aye.
And then Director Schmidt, do you approve the minutes?
Yeah.
He's
Okay.
Got on mute.
Yes,
There you
got
go.
it. There we go. Okay.
There we go. Okay,
Sorry
good.
about that.
Okay, great. I think we're good. All right,
All
that
right.
brings us to item 2, the monthly financial update.
Hello, board. This is Shelley Riley. I'm the finance management analyst. Oh, sorry, Crystal.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know if Ben was going to start it off or not, but I'm filling in. He's at the airport, so in case there's issues with communications, but we're going to actually jump to the middle of the report. So in case there's a problem with Ben's attendance, to talk about the drought impacts on our finances. So, and then we'll go back to the general monthly report at that
Okay.
time. So Shelley's going to jump to the middle of the PowerPoint presentation.
Okay, that sounds fine.
All right, so I'm gonna share my screen. You'll see the slideshow.
Yes.
All right. So starting with the drought impacts and financial projections. As you all know, we've had some financial challenges this fiscal year with the drought conditions starting in 2021. Our water use is about 20% or so conservation level compared to normal years. That means for us financially, less water consumption is less revenue. We've also experienced some expenditures higher than the adopted budget. We are going to increase the amount of water purchase from Sonoma County Water Agency. We anticipate purchasing an additional 3,000 acre feet or $4 million. We also see that our water conservation rebate program is running higher this year than normal. It's about $1.5 million higher than the adopted budget at $591,000 for a total on the year projected to end at like $2.1 million.
Shelley, can I ask quickly, could you stay on that slide for just a second? Did these funds come out of the strategic reserves or,
So yes, part of them came from the reserves. I'll give you an exact, about 1.5 million came from the reserves,
okay.
And
from the rate stabilization fund.
Which is what that fund was established to do, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, we have a slide on that in a moment. We'll get to it. in a
Okay,
second. Yeah.
great, thanks.
quick question, Shelley.
Yep.
On the SCWA water, is that 4 million more than budget to date, or is that what's projected by the end of the fiscal year?
By the end of the fiscal year.
Okay.
both of those numbers, 3,000 acre feet and the 4 million is
Okay.
over the
thank you.
budget.
Okay, okay,
Full budget.
thanks.
Mhm. So moving to the next slide, this is just detailing the water sales revenue by month. This comes in your packet every month as a attachment 1. Just getting into a little more detail. On the left-hand side, you could see the budget as originally done in June of last year. And then the right-hand side is the actual revenue we've received. So at this point in March, we would normally anticipate about $45.5 million of revenue, 77-78% of the total water sales. But in actuals, we've only received 33.6 million. So our year-to-date deficit is our year-to-date deficit is 11.9. Which is about 20% off of what we normally expect. And as you recall, our water sales is billed on a 2-month lag. Again, just to remind you all, so these are a little delayed in what's actually happening. So this is just a graph of the previous information. The light blue line is the fiscal year 22 budget. The light green line from July to March is our actual revenue received for water sales. The darker green line is our projections if the conservation rate was at 5%. So at 5%, we'd expect our year-end revenue to be $46 million, which is about $12 million, excuse me, $12.5 million less than the budget. The darker blue line assumes a 20% conservation between April and June, ending at $44 million on the year, which is $14.5 million less than what we'd anticipated with budget.
Could I ask you a question, Shelley?
Yep. Yep.
So that I noticed there's a little bit of a difference between the reduction of actual water sales in acre feet versus the revenue. So my question is, we're a little bit under, we should have about 75% of our CMF according to, how we would track normally on a fiscal year as of the end of March. So that leads me to think that we are still having a pretty higher than normal percentage of our residents who are falling behind on their bills. And I was wondering if you, at the next meeting, you could give us a list of the receivables and the aging of the receivables to see how many of our customers are falling behind, whether that's changed, given sort of the ebb of the pandemic.
Yes, we can definitely. I know that last month we did show that, and the numbers are a little bit askew because we did apply the COVID relief money to the receivables,
Right.
but we can definitely show you an updated one.
And then my other question is whether if we continue to have higher than normal delinquencies on our accounts, whether we can effectively extend the application of the COVID relief funds to this fiscal year or to this next whatever reporting period to make up for that deficit.
I don't know the answer to that question off the top of my head. I believe the COVID relief funds, though, were for a designated period of time.
That's correct.
I don't believe that we can apply them to what's happening now.
Okay, because
Unless they offer a new grant program.
okay, because what's going to happen, there's a lot of our renter residents are getting some assistance, and that's going to end in the next couple months. So I think we may see another spike in delinquencies, which goes to Director Kohler's comment at our last meeting about equity and how do we deal with a disproportionate impact on our lower income residents. So that kind of continues to be a little bit of a subtext, I think, here on this report, on this financial report.
We do have Director Bregman, modification to our payment plan that the board authorized to 5-year payment plans. So we can talk about that as well when we come back.
Yeah, that I think it's worth kind of keeping that in focus a little bit so we don't lose track of it.
Yeah, and thank you so much for raising that, Larry. I don't want to get us too off track today, but maybe in a future presentation, because I know there are, and I'm not as familiar with these as I should be. I know that there are federal relief funds. And I think you're right, Larry. I think the funds that are ending are at the state level, but there's a lot of discussion about, about making those more permanent at the federal level. EPA is exploring this. There's this, I don't know if people are familiar, but the Justice 40 program. Anyway, I don't want to merge the financial presentation with our presentations on these legislative issues, but I think it might be useful on this narrow issue to see, maybe have some further information about those relief efforts. Some of those are going to consumers directly, as you've said, Director Bragman. Some of them are actually going to counties and cities. So anyway, it might be useful to get, just per this conversation, it might be useful to get an update on that when the staff has capacity to do that.
I have one more comment and then I'll keep my mouth shut here. But, I think it also shows that our fixed fees have really helped keep us afloat. On the other hand, fixed fees do have a disproportionate impact on lower income residents. So, I don't know how we square that circle, but it's just, again, going to that equity issue that we need to deal with, because I think fixed fees are going to be part of our future.
Yeah.
Any other comments before I move on?
Does not appear so.
So this next slide incorporates all of operating revenue. Obviously at the top is the water sales numbers that I just presented with the various 5% and 20% conservation. But we want to incorporate in the other revenue of service charges, watershed management fees, and other revenue. So our total adopted budget this fiscal year was $88.7 million. As you can see under the 5% conservation, the difference between the budget is 11 million. So we did have, 5% conservation was at a 12.5% revenue loss, but we do see some other revenue losing a tiny bit of money here. Service charges we're projecting to be about $500,000 less than budget at 22 million. The watershed management fee is about $100,000 less than the budget at 4.9 million. Here on the other revenue line, you see it's at 4.8 projected for year end, $2.1 million higher than the budget. This again is purely from the COVID relief funds. So this additional revenue has slightly offset the other 3 revenue loss categories. So under the 20% conservation, we would see about a $13 million loss of revenue at 75.7 million. So between 5 and 20% conservation, we have a range of $11 to $13 million total revenue loss for operating. And these numbers do not reflect the CMF. Just a note. So moving on to operating expenditures. This slide is very similar to the slide showed last month. Our total operating budget at adoption was 88.7 million. We're forecasting to end the year at 88.4 million. Personnel services, we expect to end at $48 million, which is about a $5.8 million savings. This is mainly due to vacancy savings from turnover and retirements in the district. Again, under water purchases, we expect a $4 million increase over the original budget to end the year at $12.1 million. The conservation rebates are expected to end the year at 2.1 million with a 1.5 million increase over budget. The year-to-date costs right now are about 1.5 million. And the other categories we expect to be right around budget for a total savings about $300,000. So in summary, to move on and how these revenues and expenditures affect the operating unrestricted fund balance. We began this fiscal year at 32.6 million. With the 20% conservation, we'd expect to see about a $13 million revenue loss. We have a 300,000 expenditure savings, slightly offsetting that, and along with that transfer in from the rate stabilization fund of 1.5 million for the conservation efforts, ending our balance at June 30th at 21.4 million. So the total decrease would be about $11.2 million on the year.
Kelly, let me interrupt you here. So there's a couple additional expenditures for this fiscal year that will be coming to the board that are not accounted for in this slide. We had a discussion about it after this was created. So one of those is paving. We're going to be coming to the board for an increase in paving budget of 600,000 for paving costs. And then we're also starting to talk about pumping water over from Sulahule starting next month. And that's not budgeted. If we were to rent the generators and pumps, it would be about another $1.5 million for this fiscal year of unbudgeted expenditure. So, so the projected ending balance would be a bit lower for fiscal year 22. More to come on that.
So moving into next fiscal year, we wanted to provide you with a few various scenarios based on different levels of conservation and unbudgeted expenditures. Again, these don't account for the new unbudgeted expenditures that we may have in fiscal year 22. So beginning balance is still at 21.4 million, which may or may not change. So scenarios 1 and 2 assume a 20% conservation level. This equates to about a $12.2 million revenue loss. We also have in scenario 1 additional unbudgeted expenditures. We estimate about 1.1 million for the turf rebate program if the program is to continue its funding at $3 per square foot. Also, we are expecting to purchase an additional 5,000 acre feet of water, which is about 6.6 million for a total of 7.7 million of additional expenditures compared to the budget. This leaves us at scenario 1 leaves at a drastically low amount of $1.2 million in reserves. And this doesn't account for any other inflationary costs that may happen next fiscal year. Scenario 2 is slightly better than scenario 1. Basically, it's the same conservation level at 20%, but does not have the unbudgeted expenditures, leaving an ending balance at 9.2 million. Scenario 3 and 4 have a 5% conservation level, which equates to about a $3 million revenue loss. Again, scenario 3 includes the unbudgeted expenditures of $7.7 million with an ending balance of 10.7, and scenario 4 excludes those unbudgeted expenditures at 18.4 million.
Kelly, can you talk a bit about the extent to which these projections, and by the way, thank you for laying this out so clearly, it's really helpful. Can you talk about the extent to which the conservation numbers here, the revenue numbers related to conservation, did they include savings from alternatives, right? I mean, so if we didn't conserve this much, we'd basically have to go find this water someplace else.
No, this is a good question. This is really just looking at projected cash flow, and the 5,000 acre feet of water is really, we'd be maximizing how much water we can get. So the scenario 1 is really assuming this coming year is dry, and we do need to ask our customers to maintain a high level of conservation, and we need to buy additional water. The 1.5 million does not include the approximate 2 million of additional costs that Crystal noted.
Right. So that's kind of what I'm getting at. So like I say, I completely understand that, Ben, and I appreciate this is laid out this way. I'm just saying, you know, to get the complete picture, we probably need another slide after this showing that, what would be, if we went with scenarios 3 or 4, what would be the corresponding increase in cost for making up the water that would otherwise have been conserved? Because it's going to come from somewhere.
Yeah, so for this coming year, the assumption is scenario 3 and 4, we're having a wet winter, so we wouldn't need that water. That's kind of the concept here.
Right. If we don't need it, we don't need it. Right. But
Right.
but I think the question, right. But if we do need it, I'm just saying I just want to be sure that we are being clear about, that we're doing a full calculation of what conservation means in terms of cash flow, because to the extent that we are not conserving and we need to instead, find additional sources of water, like that needs to be calculated, it seems to me, into that projection
Got
here.
it. So we could add, I think, on an annual basis, we found that this is the turf replacement program, that 30 plus acre feet, what the cost of that additional water would be.
Yeah.
I think also what she's talking about is costing out 100% of consumption versus the 5% or 20%. So there's a loss of revenue with conservation, but there's also a savings because we're not purchasing water from Sonoma to provide that
Right.
water. So
Right.
I think
Yes.
that's more, I think that's more the goal of what Director Kohler wants to illustrate. So, it's an interesting point for sure.
I think a lot of water utilities, maybe the way to put it this way. I think a lot of water utilities are including in these kinds of calculations the financial benefits of avoided cost. I think that's what I'm
There you
really
go.
saying.
Yeah.
I guess what I'm looking for is a line that looks at these reductions in revenue, but includes avoided costs that would otherwise have to be expended. That's what I'm getting at here. I think that's becoming more standard in this kind of accounting. Is that resonating with you? With the
There are 2 avoided costs for sure. There's when you're using 20% less water, you have 20% less power and consumables. And
Right.
that's a very clear number that could be reflected. And then you would need additional water.
Right.
I'm not sure that we can make that up with our system, but from an annual standpoint, it's 5,000 may be close to maximizing the water we can purchase.
Yeah. Are we, before we do our budget, is this the tail end of our biannual budget fiscal year 23, or are we going to be doing a cost of service analysis for fiscal year 23?
We're beginning a cost of service analysis for FY24 and the rate setting process. That's where we're in now.
Okay.
The current COSA covers us through FY23.
Okay.
So if I could just add, I think what Cynthia's getting at is perhaps there's a scenario 1.5 where the 20% conservation is essentially 5,000 acre feet. And if it's a wet winter, this coming winter, we wouldn't have to purchase the additional 5,000 acre feet from Sonoma. However, if it's a dry winter coming up this coming winter, and we have conservation of 5,000, and we want to top off our reservoirs, then we would have to purchase the 5,000 acre feet. So that's scenario 1.
Yeah, I like that. I like 1.5. That's a great suggestion, Crystal.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Are there
I think just generally including avoided costs. And I take Ben's point that there's kind of 2 categories. There's the hard costs. We're not producing this water, so we're saving this much, as you indicated, in energy and other costs. But there's also that cost that would need to be estimated based on the annualization, which is, if we have this water because of conservation or efficiencies, that may reduce our need to make other expenditures, as Crystal has just described.
Do we
Comment?
anticipate, I was going to ask other question. We've had some additional unexpected expenditures related to pumping for Suluhuli and other things. Are there, do we, and I'm looking at those FY23 scenarios, and are we capturing likely, but still maybe, unexpected costs?
Right, so if there were to be some sort of disaster that, needed addressing in the coming year, and there wasn't enough in the operating reserves, then yes, there's certainly business continuity scenarios that we have to think through, whether that's a short-term loan, commercial loan, to keep paying the bills if there's a loss in revenue above what we expect.
Okay, I think that makes sense. I feel like it's one of those things where we probably, I would imagine it seems like we tend to have some unexpected costs that tend to pop up, like lines break, paving needs to happen. And it would just be, I think, helpful to maybe have a sense of what that usual unexpected additional expense looks like when we're looking at a scenario one that looks very precarious at getting down to 1.5.
Yeah, to the extent that some scenario affects assets that could be funded through capital, we'd be able to handle that. But if it's a scenario where we lose revenue, then that's a different scenario that we'd have to think through.
Can I add one quick question, Crystal, on Suluhuli? And I know you're going to come back, but it might be time for us to relook at getting power out there and seeing, because that cost could be capitalized as opposed to coming out of operations. And given the seeming permanency of that reservoir sort of being used more, maybe we could find a grant, something like that. It just seems like Suluhuli is becoming a more regular contributor to our, water supply. So, I think we should take another look at getting some power out there so we don't have to burn diesel and rent generators and do all that every year. And to come out of operating, we should maybe consider seeing how much it would cost to capitalize making it a permanent electrification.
Okay, certainly. We'll reach out to PG&E and start some discussions on some what the capital cost would entail.
Okay.
I think that's a good, I support Director Bradman's suggestion there. And I think he raises a point that we've discussed a number of times, and I think this really crystallizes it, which is that a big chunk of these conservation funds should not be operating costs, right? These are not annual expenditures. People don't change out their toilets every year. They don't change out their landscaping every year. So this really, I think, highlights how we should be looking at moving some of these costs into capital. We want to be amortizing those costs over time so we don't have this kind of strain on our operating budget. And as has been well established and discussed by our prior CFO, that is now allowed under GASB's rules. So I'd like to see us return to that conversation so that we can bring down this stress on the operating budget and stop treating expenses that are not annual expenses, but our longer term investments more appropriately within the budget.
Those are both great ideas. I support them.
So continuing on, we just wanted to put this all in reference to the last few years of our operating unrestricted fund balance. So you could see in fiscal year 19, we are at 27.4 million. 20 was 26.2 million. 21 was 32.6 million. And then we have our estimated 21.4 million for this year and the 4 different scenarios for fiscal year 23. So graphically, you can see there's huge drops in the various scenarios, anywhere from 92% of reserves to 14%. So just to recap what was mentioned earlier, this is just our rate stabilization fund balance as of March 31st. We began the year at $9.4 million. We had expenditures on the emergency intertie, the Castania pump station, Peacock Gap, and then we also funded conservation to 1.5 million for a total ending balance of 2.25 million. So a total spend of approximately a little over 7 million for this year from the stabilization fund. So again, our financial challenges will continue into next year with a strong possibility of the drought continuing. Again, less water consumption is less revenue for the district. To recap, our possible increases in unbudgeted expenditures for the rebate program, as well as the purchased water, as well as the expected inflation that is increasing the cost of consumables, which Crystal already mentioned we're starting to feel with our paving. Our reserve balances are trending low. Specifically, the unrestricted balance is trending low, with the severity depending on the level of water conservation and our unbudgeted expenditures. The rate stabilization fund again is down this year, which means we can be less reliant on it in the future. We also still have potential operating costs from the emergency intertie project, about $10 million, and that's if the capital project doesn't move forward in the future. So some approaches that can help address the financial strain caused by this dry weather season we're having is to review the unbudgeted rebate incentives. We can also consider a hiring freeze. The general manager has already taken action to slow down the recruitment process and critically review all vacant positions. We'd also consider using the pension reserve fund, which is at a balance of $2 million to pay part of the CalPERS annual liability payment. This would lower the drawdown of our operating fund.
How much would it reduce it by? Can you
It's
calculate?
2 million. I mean, we would transfer the 2 million to pay the part of the payment.
But what would that, what kind of annual savings would that create? Do you know?
So it would be a one-time direct $2 million benefit. Our debts, our CalPERS, I believe, is at around 10 million.
It's 8.6 next year.
8.6. So this would just be a direct $2 million one time, but we do need it, savings to our operating fund. We are recommending that we bring this item back to a regular
Okay,
board meeting.
for further discussion. Okay.
Yeah, that's a restricted account, so we'd have to have board authorization to make that transfer. So we would come back to the board with that recommendation.
Okay.
Mhm.
And not to repeat, because I think this is a fine list, but isn't this exactly where we need a bullet about moving some of these longer term investments in permanent demand reduction to capital? So I'd like to, I know we've talked about that at the board before, but it seems like this is the right time to add a bullet and bring that back to a conversation with the board at a full meeting. Is that something you'd be willing to do, Ben?
Well, we do have scheduled for the next finance committee an update on our capital program and completing our 10-year plan. So that's a good time to do it.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think that is a good time to continue that discussion we've had.
That's fine. I would have liked to have seen that here. We've talked about it a bunch, and it does seem, unless I'm missing something, like a fairly substantial way of addressing this. We are still talking about that bond issuance for this year, right?
No, the board selected not to proceed with the bond issue.
Well, okay, but I mean,
What
I'm
I've been imagining is we would incorporate that discussion and plan for it as part of our upcoming COSA and rate development discussion for
Okay.
FY24 and beyond.
But we are going to be going out for new bonds before 2024 would be my expectation.
There are not current plans to do that.
Okay, well, maybe we should talk about that. Because I mean, I'm just thinking about the water. I don't want to get too far afield, but just looking at the water supply assessment, every single option there is going to require some kind of bond issuance sooner rather than later to move forward with those, really any of those opportunities, I think.
Yes, a good number of them will require a number of years for planning, design, that sort of stuff before we get into the big capital costing. But we will get an indication of that come June, July.
Okay.
And the last bullet is to replenish the operating and rate stabilization funds as part of the upcoming cost of service analysis. So in summary, the financial challenges are continuing into the following fiscal year, with the severity dependent on rainfall, conservation levels, and unbudgeted expenses. And again, here's our recommendation to use the 2 million from the pension fund to pay the CalPERS liability.
And we would bring that back to a regular board meeting. And we are, in addition to this, we are moving forward with a conditional hiring freeze, and it's going to be conditional based on the nature of the positions. You know, and the operator that we need to keep the wheels on the bus will be different than other areas in the organization. And we'll also be bringing back conservation incentives at an upcoming board meeting for discussion, because we simply cannot let our reserves get down to where, you know, scenario one, we don't yet know how the coming year is going to look. So we're going to need to take some immediate action.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that's exactly right. It's at the same time, I think it's worth emphasizing that the reserves have functioned as they were designed to, right? So, you know, the fact that we now have to replenish them is simply a function of using them appropriately at the right time. So
that's exactly right, Director Kohler. The rate stabilization and our operating reserves as designed allowed us to get through this water shortage emergency we're in.
yeah. And I'm just aware that other districts really had to put, you know, drought rates into effect that were fairly onerous, something we didn't have to do because we had planned for and had at our, you know, had available to us these reserves. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I absolutely do. And, you know, the question in front of us is the unpredictability of how long, what the coming year looks like. But the planning we've done with our reserves did absolutely help us.
Yeah.
I thought it was more complicated than that, though. Weren't we not able to apply a drought surcharge because of the 218 requirements?
Yeah,
I mean, our normal rules would said we would have kicked it in,
Well,
right?
Yeah.
we
On the
will.
triggers.
Yes, as
I'm
part
in a
of this
meeting. I'll call you back.
proposal process, we're going to be ensuring that in future droughts, we do have more options in front of us, including drought rates.
Right. My point is just
Exactly.
we didn't have to do it. So I'm not disagreeing with you, Larry. I'm just saying, you know, that the reserves functioned as they were designed to function, and other districts really hit their ratepayers pretty hard. So I think we're going to be able to, we're obviously going to have to take some action to replenish the reserves. I just think we're going to be able to do it in a way that is going to have less impact to the ratepayer.
Perhaps, you know, we would have kicked them in, Cynthia, if we could have. That's my point.
Well, I'm
So-
not sure we agree about that. I'm not
Well,
sure we
that's
would
what
have
our-
inflicted that kind of financial pain on our ratepayers if we didn't need to, is my point.
That's what our
Especially
triggers
during
say.
COVID and all the rest of it.
That's what our triggers say to do. When we hit certain levels, then we're supposed to do certain things, and we didn't do
they're-
those because we couldn't.
Well, they're triggers. They're not, you know, they're not laws. And, you know, given COVID and other circumstances, I kind of don't want to, I'm just saying the reserves were there for a reason. They were designed
Absolutely.
for that reason.
Absolutely.
They were executed. And I think we should be emphasizing that. I think that is what is important here, is that the reserves functioned as they were designed to function.
Well, and that's all true, but I
Right.
think we also have to talk about what rate we're going to pay them back. I'd like to get some real solid feeling about that, Ben, in the very near future. Are we looking at a few years or 20 years? And the second thing is, I'm not so sure we should commit the 2 million from the pension fund. I think we should keep some reserve in reserve. And the fact that it's restricted makes it even easier to keep it there. And just in case, you know, the worst comes to the worst, we still got $2 million of line of credit, if you want to look at it that way. available to us. Once we spend it, it's gone.
It's a good point. Money's fungible, and keeping it here in reserve, quote unquote, right, is something we can do as well. So if the board prefers to hold it where it is, we know it's there, and we could do that as well.
Yeah,
That
I'm not
makes
indicating a
sense.
preference one way or the other. I'm just saying, at least speaking for me, not for the board, but I just want us to make sure everybody's thinking about that, okay, before a decision is made. I understand taking the pain off of the budget deficit. I got it. But, you know, maybe you don't want to pull all your savings accounts down at the same time.
No, I think it's a good point. And we will obviously be continuing to monitor and reporting to the board where our operating reserves are. And were they to get drawn down in X months, that would probably be the opportunity to have the discussion.
But you're looking for direction here, whether to bring this to the full board, this recommendation. And I think that based on this conversation we've just had, there's not a need to necessarily do this now, and that we could hold it in reserve for a later point in time.
I think, yes, I think so. We all know it's there. We have 2-some million in rate stabilization. We have this in pension, and we still are in a reasonably good spot with operating reserves. So as we get into the summer and we see the level of conservation that's occurring, and as we get into the fall and winter and see if we're going to have a wet or dry year, we'll be able to have a more informed discussion.
I think that makes sense. I don't expect that we would be seeing, in our terms of our conservation projections and the impact on our budget. I don't see our water use a 5% conservation being the likely scenario. I don't think we would be encouraging that. And so I feel like the more operable assumption is the 20%. And around that, we ought to be looking at what our scenarios are so that we do not need to draw down our reserves down to 1.5. I think that's a very, very risky level of reserve, given we have no idea what subsequent years are going to look like either.
Yeah, I think we've got some strong consensus on that. Do we have any other comments on this item before we move on to the next? Oh, I'm sorry, before we move on to public comment?
So we still have the beginning half of the slideshow.
Oh, sorry. You did such a great job. I thought we were done. Okay, sorry. Let's go back to that.
Okay, so let me skip forward here. And I'm going to transfer it over to McYoung, the finance manager.
Good morning, board. So this is the rather actual numbers as of March 2022. So we are at 75% of the fiscal year. So going to this slide in revenue. So overall operating revenue is 57 million, which is about 65% of the budget. And fire flow revenue is 2.5 million, around 50%. And this is by design. We'll receive the rest in August. And CMF and other miscellaneous capital revenue is about 13 million, which is about 71% of the budget. Next slide. So looking at the water revenue, so this is a breakdown of specifically water sales and then fixed revenue. So our water sales is approximately 34 million, which is about 57.4% of the budget, significantly lower than our expected budgeted revenue. And the other components are service charge and watershed fees, which are fixed revenue, and they're tracking along slightly behind the budgeted revenue. Next slide. So this shows the so red bar is the fiscal year 21 and blue bar is the fiscal year 22. So if you look at this, February, March total water sales are slightly higher than the same month in the last fiscal year. So this trend is not necessarily the indication of customers consuming more water. This is rather contributed to dry weather conditions. So February and March in 21, we had more rainfall than in February and March in 22.
Mhm.
And then next slide. So this is just a comparison to fiscal year 21 for different customer classes, water consumption, not in dollar, but in acre feet. So overall, all across different customer class, we are down roughly 25% compared to 21. And next slide. So this shows a tier revenue, tier consumption as of March, year to date, not just a month of March, but year to date revenue compared to last 7 years. So if you look at year to date revenue for the last 8 years, fiscal year 22 is the lowest. So we are significantly lower compared to prior fiscal years.
Mhm.
And next slide. And this slide is a small sample of residential data in Tiburon and Belvedere. So yellow bar is the fiscal year 22, and gray bar is 21, and orange bar is 20, and blue bar is 19. So again, you can see February, March, we have a slight spike in the consumption. And again, this is contributed to the dry weather, since we did not have any rain in March and February, compared to in 21, we had some rainfall in March and February. And next slide. This is another AMI data for business customers. So for business customers, we have a slight increase in the month of March rather than March and February. And I would say this is contributed to the opening of businesses from the COVID restriction. So we have a slight spike in February and March. So overall expenditures, or our overall operating expense is at 72%, and total year-to-date expenditures are 62%. However, this does not include the capital expenditures that are spent but not paid yet. So next slide will show that commitment that we will be paying in the next couple of months. So as you can see, there are 11 million in commitment that will be paid in the next couple of months by end of the fiscal year. And we will be at, if you consider that, we'll be at 70% of the overall budget. So looking at our ending fund balance, so overall fund balance is at 75 million, but our operating unrestricted fund balance is 26 million, which is about 3 months of our operating cash. And compared to prior fiscal year, we are significantly lower, trending really low. So, and Shelley already went over our projected fiscal year. So do you have any questions, further questions, or any comments?
Any board comments before we go to public comments?
Just a real quick one. Is there still a moratorium on shutoffs under state law? Anybody know?
I believe so, but I wouldn't swear to it.
I think that ended the end of December of last year, but we can confirm that.
Yeah, because the governor did just extend the drought emergency. So I thought that there were things in the executive order that may have gotten extended. So that would be great if you would double check that, Molly.
Okay.
Yeah,
we can do that.
just an update on that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that was related to the COVID though, and not drought, the shut off restriction.
Yeah.
Initially, yes, that's true. We'll confirm, but
Yeah. Thank you.
want to be sure that we're giving you the right information, of course.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, with that, Terry, let's go to public comments on this item.
There are none.
Okay, that brings us to, let me go back to my agenda, the second item, or I guess the third item, which is the quarterly investment report.
So this is my item again. Can you all see the slideshow?
Not yet.
now?
Yes.
So this is the quarterly update as of March 2022. For our investment portfolio is at a 0.36% yield compared to LAIF, which was at 2.8%. Our fiscal year-to-date interest was $130,000 year-to-date of our $74 million portfolio. So there has been some increase in these rates over the last 3 months. As we all know, interest rates have been on the rise. Our portfolio went up about a little less than 0.2%. That's it. Questions?
Do we have any board questions on this item? Seeing none, do we have any public comments on this item?
There are none.
Okay, we've come to the end of our agenda. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
folks.
Take care. Bye-bye.